Cusichaca Valley, high in the Peruvian Andes. Today, the only inhabitants of the valley floor are 15 families of Peruvian Indians, scratching a bare living from the soil. But all around them lies evidence of a flourishing past, buildings and farm terraces constructed 500 years ago. For this was the heartland of the Inca, whose empire in size and organization rivaled ancient Rome. The valley is now the working center for the Cusichaca Research Project. It wants to find out how the Inca and the people who went before them lived. And it's testing the astonishing idea that one-time Inca fields and irrigation canals might be revived after centuries of decay. Given present-day help, could the Cusichaca Valley be made to flourish once more, as it did in the days of the imperial Inca? The sacred valley of the Inca carries the railway, which is the only way into Cusichaca. The road stops short, there is no landing strip, and the river is not navigable. The leader of the Cusichaca project is archaeologist Dr. Kendall.
Somebody's been trying to argue that the actual course of the river's been changed. But what's paying a bit more?
Kendall spends 5 months a year in Peru and the rest of her time in England raising money for the work. The project's been coming to Cusichaca in collaboration with the Peruvian National Institute of Culture since 1978. The railway and the river Urubamba both cut across the lower end of the valley, where the project camps on a ledge hidden below the main valley floor. The team's work is mainly archaeological research, and it relies on the efforts of up to 80 volunteers every year, most of them Peruvian or British students. Kendall's enthusiasm for the valley has brought them all here.
When I first came here, which must be 15 years at least ago now, I was very excited by finding lots of Inca remains, lots of pre-Inca remains, and in a fantastic state of preservation. The architecture of the Inca period is all here, not just the buildings and well-defined sites, but all the roads, the canals, the terrace systems, everything that went with them.
The three chief groups of Inca buildings are the fort, the town, and the temple. On a ridge commanding the valley floor is the fort of Vilcanota.
I think this has to be the first Inca site built in the area, because the Incas were always concerned when they occupied an area that they should build a first substantial hold in it. It symbolizes the Inca presence. It enables them then to go ahead and develop the area with their engineers and architects.
The fort was hurriedly erected to stand guard while the town of Projecto was built below. Projecto's name in English simply means the terraced town. The 10 rows of terraces were not so much for growing crops as to stabilize the hillside below the buildings and to symbolize Inca power. Projecto's abandoned ruins look across to the little Cusichaca River. On the riverbank stands the temple of Pulpituyoc, named by the Spanish the place of the pulpit. The rituals of Pulpituyoc included water, still the symbol of life in the valley. In the central tower, Inca ancestors and the sun may have been worshipped by priests who came through a private door from the vestry or robing room below. Outside the Inca ruins, the rest of the valley floor is occupied by the stony fields and scattered houses of the Chamana people, the present-day Indians. The archaeological work starts in and around the fort, the town and the temple. Stand back and the areas for transforming the valley's agriculture also become visible. Down by the river are low, flat terraces, the land farmed by the Indians today. 200 meters above this fertile region, next to the fort of Vilcanota, lie 35 hectares, 86 acres of disused tableland, which the project wants to return to life. And at Cusichaca, 200 meters higher still, a smaller area is also part of the scheme. Could these sterile fields once more grow crops if their broken down irrigation canals were restored all the way down from the hills? And what gives archaeologists the impulse to attempt an engineering project?
Maybe that one came a little bit from the heart in the beginning. We found out in our studies that the Incas had rehabilitated the pre-Inca canals. Why shouldn't we, after all, rehabilitate pre-Inca and Inca canals and keep the tradition going? So we have incorporated that as part of our study, and I feel it justifies to some extent the resources that people have put into the project, and it leaves something positive afterwards, hopefully. That's still to be seen.
Only £50,000 is available for research and rebuilding, but this experiment could change the face of the Andes. All along the mountain spine, far beyond the boundaries of modern Peru, the hills are covered with disused Inca and pre-Inca farm terraces. If the project succeeds, these too might be restored. Cusichaca's position is in the center, 90 kilometers from the city of Cuzco. Cuzco was where the Inca came from. The Inca Pachacuti, a military and organizing genius, became their ruler in AD 1438 and began to extend their territory beyond the nearby mountains. The Inca expanded from a tribe into an empire under Pachacuti and his son Topa Inca. The empire was soon over 3,000 kilometers long and under Pachacuti's grandson held about 8 million people. Then in 1532, Francisco Pizarro led a Spanish invasion, which in a few short months totally destroyed the Inca state. In Cuzco itself, Spanish buildings went up on top of the remains of Inca palaces. And ever since Pizarro, Spanish Catholicism has hidden the earlier religion and culture of Peru. On the hillside above Cuzco, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, watching over the former capital, shows the elaborate scale on which the Inca worked in stone. took organization to build these massive rows of fortifications. It also took organization for the Inca to provide roads, public health, and sufficient food across 3,000 kilometers. Channeling rivers, carving farm terraces, and building canals linked these achievements and depended on them. They all fitted together to make the Inca picture. Could understanding the complex Inca system help the canal experiment today at Cusichaca? To obtain evidence, the project surveys the valley and maps unknown sites to see how they fit into the network. It analyzes soils for their chemical content and studies the botany, geology and zoology of the area. It compares techniques employed by the Inca with those used by their present-day descendants. Put together, the results rebuild Cusichaca's past. At the fort of Vilcanota, the first step in the detective story begins with the archaeology. Excavation shows that there were people living here long before the Inca arrived, 5 centuries ago.
We're standing in the courtyard of an Inca fort. We've been excavating here for about 6 months. And what we've done is we've excavated the Inca occupation deposits, and beneath we've found a lot of Inca terracing. They've used a lot of large stone to terrace up the site to make it level. And on top of the large stone there is small stone and soil deposited. Underneath the terracing deposit we found the destruction of a pre-Inca building. We can see the wall running along to the left, and it's been terraced into the decomposed natural on the right-hand side. What's interesting about this building is it cuts an earlier floor surface, which is very similar to floor levels that we found dating to about 500 BC. So it is obvious that this fort has been used almost continuously from the period of 500 BC right through to the arrival of the Incas.
Inca and pre-Inca buildings are easily told apart. Inca structures are regularly laid out and rectangular, reflecting the organized nature of their society. Where the remains of pre-Inca buildings are still to be seen above ground, they are more circular and haphazardly arranged. There are no fewer than 5 pre-Inca cultures at Cusichaca. The project can also show differences in the pottery. Late pre-Inca pots are rather free in appearance, whilst those of the Inca have an almost mass-produced quality.
Now this pot here is a very good example of an Inca utilitarian pot. The most interesting thing about it is that it's very similar to some of the utilitarian pottery that's used nowadays for cooking, storage, various other day-to-day purposes in the houses. There are some things about it which are distinctively Inca and not modern. These little handles which come up like a pair of ears on the rim, red paint on the inside of the rim here, and this sort of ovoid shape. Now this pot was interesting because it was found at Projecto, and inside there were some baby's bones. Highly unusual. One doesn't usually find either infant or adults buried within the settlement. Now if we move from that to pre-Inca pottery, again one can compare the shape. This is the same kind of pot used for the same kind of purpose as the Inca pot. Completely different shape of the handles, the rim, a different sort of profile, and on the inside it has this decoration which is very characteristic of pre-Inca pottery. One never finds that in the Inca period. Also, you can see on the inside here how very poorly finished the whole pot is. The walls are very thin, very brittle, the fabric very soft. Preservation not very good. Nonetheless, it's extremely unusual to find a more or less complete pre-Inca pot. It's quite impressive in its own way.
The Inca lived close to the valley floor, whilst pre-Inca settlements reached halfway up the hills. The high reaches were left to grazing animals, like the alpaca. In the middle zone, pre-Inca farmhouses looked out from sites like Cusichaca, which gave wide views in all directions and were safe from unexpected attack. And possession of the higher fields determined one crop the late pre-Inca grew. Peru is the home of the potato. Until recently, there were at least 200 varieties available. The cold climate in the middle region, where the pre-Inca concentrated, kept the tubers free of pests and diseases. But the cold which protected the potatoes would have killed the other great Andean crop, maize. The pre-Inca could grow it only in their lower fields. Maize needs water during the dry months of the Andean year, August to November. To guarantee the crop, the pre-Inca had to lead irrigation canals down from the melting snows in the mountains. In its second detective step, the project mapped the pre-Inca field system. And in an area which has never been fully surveyed, it traced the half-buried lines of the canals. When Pachacuti took over at Cusichaca, his army made it safe to grow maize on the valley floor itself. Fresh terraces were built along the banks of the rivers, and people forcibly moved downhill to work on them. The Inca had only to add to the canals they inherited to make their new fields thrive. Is there hard scientific backing for this project evidence of increasing maize cultivation? Maize differs from nearly all other cereal crops in the way it uses carbon dioxide from the air. That's the basis of a remarkable measuring technique developed at the British Museum Research Laboratory. Under test here are human thigh bones from Cusichaca. Maize absorbs from the air a naturally occurring isotope called carbon-13. Anyone eating maize stores this carbon-13 in their bones. By analyzing samples from the bones, the amount of maize in the owner's diet can be measured centuries later. The method begins by taking small samples cut from the big bones and soaking them in hydrochloric acid. The acid dissolves the rigid skeletal material of the bones and leaves behind a substance called collagen, a protein in which the carbon-13 is concentrated. The collagen is then burnt in oxygen to change the carbon-13 back into carbon dioxide gas. In this form, the quantity of isotope present is measured by a method called mass spectrometry. The laboratory hopes that eventually, when it's analyzed enough bones, it'll be able to plot the spread of maize as a cultivated plant in South America. Cusichaca took part in that process.
What we've discovered from our measurements of Cusichaca material is that in the early period, before Inca times, pre-1440 AD, the importance of maize was much less than it was later on. In fact, it was 15 to 25% of the diet in the early period, and in later times, this rose to 50%, it doubled, and I think this is a very important and interesting discovery.
As the project predicted, the quantity of maize eaten at Cusichaca increased. But is it possible to know how much was grown there? And Kendall thinks it is, and she starts by calculating the population of Cusichaca. There's evidence that the uses of Inca buildings and the numbers of people living in them can be worked out from the way they're designed and grouped together.
After all, the architecture is the biggest artifact of the Inca period. So first it needed to be described, and in order to do that I travelled throughout Peru, Ecuador and into Bolivia as well to compile an inventory of forms. The modern architect, we all know, has to work to a brief which is set before him by his employer. Well, I think the Inca architects, and in fact architects all over the world, have always had to work like that. So from that we can get a good idea what the architect was trying to build for. Now, if we analyse a site in the context of its geography, its roads of access, water, we can start getting quite close to the function of actually individual buildings.
From gable to foundation, Dr. Kendall has listed more than 70 social arrangements which determined the architectural form of Inca settlements. Anne Kendall assesses how many people lived in each house. She can work out who lived where.
I've just walked through a series of courtyards, each of which are surrounded by 4 buildings. The buildings vary a bit, but the pattern is the same. And it seems that they must have been occupied by large families, including grandparents. Here, though, the pattern changes, and we've got 3 buildings facing the area I've just come from. If I walk through now to the 3rd building of the group, the access to which is through this building here and a narrow doorway in its back wall. This ensures, I think, that people who are not wanted into the area are kept out. This courtyard affords a lot of privacy, and I'm very much in favour of the interpretation here that the leader of the community, called by the Incas a curaca, lived here. And of course the position is here right bang in the middle of the community, the heart of the town, and so it was rather a prestigious position for him to be in.
So at the end of a long trail of detective work, how many people lived at Cusichaca? Dr. Kendall calculates that the permanent population was some 1,300 people. At Projecto, these barrack-like buildings could hold another 500 who came to work on the harvest. 1,800 people in total. Project surveys found the fields they worked. Studying land usage by today's farmers shows the area needed to feed 1,800 people for a year in Inca times. All the fields remaining could produce surplus food from land where only 100 people live today. The conclusion is that 1,800 Inca farming here could grow 4 times more food than they themselves needed to eat. All this extra production gives the clue to Cusichaca's existence. 30 kilometers away lies Cusichaca's mysterious neighbor, the mountaintop city of Machu Picchu. Where did this great religious center grow its food?
Well, at Machu Picchu, most of the terraces seem to have been built for counteracting the slopes, for providing a base for the buildings, for landscaping the site. They're very narrow. They wouldn't have been efficient for production at all. So I think the difference between the two is that Machu Picchu was functioning for a whole range of uses, particularly connected with religious and ritual ceremonies, and Cusichaca was concerned really with keeping places like Machu Picchu alive. It was feeding them. It was exporting crops to Cuzco and to Machu Picchu.
After the conquest, Inca society collapsed, but the agricultural system took longer to die. The valley eventually fell into the hands of a religious order called the Bethlemites. The Bethlemites used the profits from the valley to run their church and hospital in the regional capital at Cuzco. They kept very complete records of the money they spent and the crops they grew between 1695 and 1822. And Kendall has read the records.
We see that the numbers of people are very important because the capital input is high in the middle of the 18th century when there was most maize being produced, and it was low when less and less maize was produced from these lands up till 1822, partly because people were dying from diseases, there were pests, and also because they were going to the Chilean wars. It's very interesting to note that the priests who were in charge of the hacienda actually went to some lengths to get people to work on the lands. In other archives, I found complaints about them. Apparently, they retained people against their own will. Once somebody crossed over into the land, they were prevented from moving out again. So important was it to get a workforce.
After the departure of the Bethlemites, the banks of the canals were finally trodden down by animals imported from Europe. Step by step, the canals fell into disuse. The story of decline began to change with the project's arrival in 1978. It still has problems with its own food supply, especially the last stage, delivery across the river. Boxes and people travel by a roya, a ramshackle platform slung from a cable.
I'll go right through there. Can you fucking get through? I'll set it on this box right there.
For the project to succeed, the valley had to grow food itself again. The first question, was the soil still in good heart? Soil testing began, digging into old terraces on the tableland. The results were encouraging. Fertility needed building up, preferably using crops which put nitrogen into the ground. However, the structure of the soil itself was sound.
We always knew that this area could produce well because I've had a series of conversations with an old man, Don Martín Escobedo, who's 103 years old, and he remembers working on a rehabilitation of the canal about 50 or 60 years ago. When they completed the work, he says not to the standards of today, fortunately, And after they completed the work, the tableland yielded good maize crops with peas and beans as well as quinoa. So we do know that this area can produce with irrigation.
But did the campesinos, the local people, actually want the extra land for growing crops? Growing and selling food dominates the lives of the Chamana Indians. So it was an attractive suggestion, but not an easy decision for them to take. This is the family of the present leader of the Chamana. His people had many problems to solve. Who legally owned the land? Could they organize themselves to work it together? And what were the chances of selling any surplus food they might grow? After waiting patiently for 2 years, the project thought the signs were favorable to go ahead. The canal, which originally watered the tableland, starts from the melting snow just below 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet. It has 4 branches. One runs to a now derelict pre-Inca village above the fort. Another 2 come down to pre-Inca fields in valleys above the tableland. The major trunk route reaches the 35 hectares, 86 acres of the tableland itself. After 4 years' struggle, the central section, from Inlet 3 downwards, was restored and put in working order as far as Cusichaca and its small fields. The Cusichaca fields were planted with a crop of native beans. It was a preliminary trial of the project theory, and the remains of a successful season show that it passed the test. But the real challenge had to be rebuilding the entire canal running down to the vastly larger area of the tableland. Work began using the methods of the original builders. The project excavated the canal's old course and dug out the rubbish of centuries. The construction materials were those used by the pre-Inca and Inca themselves, rocks. The canal was relined. It had to be capable of being maintained by the local people after the project leaves.
We found that the locals were well able to do the work. What they needed really was encouragement and perhaps a little bit of organisation. We also thought that the whole thing had to be handled as an experiment. You can't come in and say to people, why don't you do this, and then push them to do it. But we felt that by showing them that the job could be done and that they could do the job, then perhaps they would begin to farm the tableland.
While the project rebuilt the main canal, it continued to study the others. This canal once carried drinking water into the town of Projecto. It also supplied 5 public baths lining the road up to the town. It was part of the Inca public health system, maintained by regular government inspections. A project discovery shows how this care for people's welfare was lost. 5 graves from the end of the Inca period have been found beside the canal. One of them actually in the canal bed itself. No one buries corpses in their own drinking water supply. So the conclusion must be that the canal and concern for public health broke down almost immediately after the conquest. Today, the project is trying to restore this part of the Inca system by improving the health of the local people.
We started off by asking all the local people what they actually wanted, and that turned out to be a 4-story white hospital staffed by doctors, nurses, with a full X-ray labs and everything else, which of course is impossible. But they did realistically see that in fact some of them could be trained to work as primary healthcare workers in the valley itself.
Javier Coronel Solis is one of the local healthcare volunteers, Promotores de Salud. He's treating baby Genero for a neck abscess. Javier can't afford to give expensive medicines, but he recommends how the wound can be kept clean.
They've done very, very well over the last year, and I think one of the most exciting things was coming back here and seeing the fact that they had carried on working, and I think made quite some difference to the health of the people in the valley. If I go and visit somebody, they automatically produce some hot water to wash my hands, and they're much more conscious of boiling water, and they talk a lot about agua vida, which is boiled water.
As a result of seeing what simple hygiene can achieve, Javier is now developing his own ideas. He wants the Chamana to repair yet another dry canal for themselves to get a clean drinking water supply.
So things have been happening, but the promotores themselves felt that the one thing that they really, really needed was a building, a medical post, which could be a focus for their work. And people would know where to find them, and they could keep their books and medicines and things like that there. So one of the main things we're trying to do this year is to build a medical post. And the adobes are for the building itself. And that's all going very well. And we've bought the tin roof, and that's coming this coming week. And we hope to start building, in fact, on Monday.
Many of the features of the old Andean way of life are beginning to reappear at Cusichaca. The network is being reconnected. Machu Picchu's link with Cusichaca is being restored after a 500-year break.
Los españoles, no hay información oral.
Machu Picchu is one of the greatest tourist attractions in South America today. It's the high spot of the Inca Trail, which ends here after a 30-kilometer trek through the mountains. And that trail starts at Cusichaca. The only way from the railway to the ruins and the beginning of the trail is by a bridge built last year across the Urubamba. In Inca times, there was also a bridge. The massive foundations of the original Inca crossing support the new structure as well. It's already being used by trekking parties. Cusichaca lies only 2 kilometers away. And there, waiting at Pulpituyoc, is the handiwork of a rebuilding gang working for the INC, the Peruvian National Institute of Culture. As the Cusichaca project archaeologists finish digging the remains, the INC's workmen consolidate them and make them safe. Buildings which were in a ruinous state 6 years ago are slowly becoming more attractive to visitors. So, in the valley, some people will find their economic future in the tourist link between Cusichaca and Machu Picchu. Could Cusichaca recreate the other half of its past by growing more food? After 6 years' work, the canal is still not completed. Time is running out. And the campesinos still have their problems. Can they agree how to work the land together, forgetting old personal disputes? The only way to solve the campesinos' problem is for them to call a special assembly to debate the issues. Among those attending are the Chamana, who own the land. Also present are Javier's people from a neighboring community who would like to farm it if no one else does. They are followed by the canal workers, who feel that their efforts give them a voice in the decision too. And Kendall is there with experts from Cuzco University, ready to advise on land management in years to come. While the debate proceeds, the medical side of the project treats the children the farmers have brought with them against disease. And on the square behind the meeting house, the archaeologists tackle the campesinos at football. A full day ends in success for both Project and campesinos.
Well, the meeting was about who was going to work the land that's being rehabilitated. And basically, after a bit of talk, everyone agreed that they were going to work. And we had a show of 17 hands of people who were definitely going to start on Monday working. And the community members are going to work. That makes another 11. And then they elected a committee to run the thing. We've got a president, a sub-president, a treasurer, a secretary, and one more person. So that's 5, representing the main community and 3 other communities. So it's all been very positive.
We are now prepared to work here. There are 4 or 5 communities involved. Let's hope they all do what they've agreed to do. Let's hope they actually carry out the work. As you know, with enough people, we could work with a large community, and then we could produce more crops too. With just a few people, there's only a little work done, and that doesn't produce enough. But now we are ready to work. All the bunch are agreed about working. I think we're quite satisfied with the results of the meeting and our committee's organization.
Now events begin to move more rapidly. High up in the small fields at Cusichaca, already supplied with water, there is a crisis. Neighbors arrive to solve a problem created by the death of the farmer. Without their help, the farmer's family won't be able to get going again. Friends and relations respond with a faena, or communal work-in. They club together with the only gift they have to offer, their free labor. With local aid, Cusichaca gradually returns to life. And the lower canal from Cusichaca to the tableland is finished at last. Vital extra water supplies are linked in too, high up the mountain, only 2 days after the assembly. 6 years of working and waiting are over. The Cusichaca project has shown the way, and the Peruvian government has now decided to restore more canals elsewhere in the Andes. For the moment, there seems to be cause for celebration.
Well, I think the Inca period understood the problems. They knew that in order to achieve a certain production level, they had to put in a high input. And they did this. They built towns, they built ceremonial centers, which provided all the extra facilities that people needed. And I think that the time has come now for people to get together, to build their own little towns again, to acquire all that they need to keep them going, to provide education, medical help and so on. The Incas perhaps did it in another way, but the future lies in satisfying people who are trying to produce the production that's required in rural areas. You've got to make them happy, or otherwise why should they work?
You may like to know that the example of the Cusichacan project was successfully taken up by the Peruvian government in 1984 for low-cost rehabilitation schemes elsewhere. After concluding its two-year project, the Trust has moved its archaeological and environmental work to the Pataconcha Valley and will concentrate on the problems of soil erosion, water management and reforestation.